Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Since he was last on the show, Gary Lachman has published not one, but two new books. The first, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, is a splendid addition to what we might call his Hermetic line of books. The second and most recent, Dark Star Rising, is an examination of the novel and occult worldviews that appear to have resurged and quite possibly are impacting politics around the planet. And here's the kicker. They sort of go together, although you can, of course, certainly read one and or the other. I was, well, I don't want to say dubious, but interested to see how that might play out. This is that conversation. The prolific Mr. Lachman, welcome back.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
All right, so what shall we call this episode, Gary? Lost Trump of the Imagination?
That's the next book.
Yeah. Dark Star of the Imagination is actually kind of cool. It's not.
Oh, that's a good one. Dark Stars of the Imagination. That sounds very good.
Yeah.
Lost Secrets of the Dark Stars.
That's like, very sci-fi. No. Yes, that can be the movie version. Yes. All right.
Yeah.
We are joking about this because, you're crazy prolific, and since we've last spoke, you've actually published two books. Lost Knowledge of the Imagination and more recently Dark Star. So, and as I do for these shows, I tend to listen to other interviews you've done more recently about them, and you kind of made the point or the case that they hang together, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right, but they do. And it's kind of a really interesting way of approaching a macro topic. But I guess if we start with Lost Knowledge to begin with, it's my understanding the title comes from Kathleen Rain?
Yes, the Blake Scholar, poet, and essayist Kathleen Rain, who some years ago I had the pleasure of interviewing and met her on a couple other occasions in London. And she, in her writing, she talked about what she called the lost knowledge of the imagination, or the teaching of the imagination, and rejected knowledge, or forbidden, and so on, various terms of that kind. And what she meant by this was this way of seeing the imagination that she found in the Romantic poets, in Blake, but also people like Coleridge and Shelley and Keats. And for her, what they were talking about when they were writing their poems, and was they were describing in their metaphors and their images this knowledge of the inner world, knowledge of our interior terrain, which traditionally was called the soul. And this was something that she felt was completely lost in the modern age. She realized this when she went to Cambridge in the 1920s to study science. Strangely enough, not literature. She figured that there was no point in her studying what she was already reading, and she wanted to learn more about the nature that she had already been introduced to in this imaginative way through the great poets, and she wanted to sort of learn more about in its actually, sort of physical or external form. And so she was studying botany and biology, and but she still read poetry. But the poetry that was very popular then was W.H. Auden, and or even earlier was T.S. Eliot, and it wasn't the romantic sort of transcendental visionary poetry.
Yeah, she went
to intimate
college,
poetry.
She went to college liking all the uncool poets, which is like a terrible thing to do.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. And so she felt that this the sort of thing that she had discovered in herself and in these poets was completely forgotten. It had been abandoned, and it was considered just the imagination, or it was just considered fantasy, or these sort of high, sort of falutin flights of rhetoric and all that. But what she believed, and what she came to see in people like Blake and Coleridge and others, was that it was actually a mapping out of a real interior terrain, of a real interiority, and that the symbols and images and the metaphors and even the rhythms and the rhymes in some way were echoing, or some way embodied or acted as sort of a mnemonic to remind us of this interior world. And this was also part of the tradition of Neoplatonism that went back to Alexandria in the first, second centuries of the Christian era. But again, this was something that is part of this tradition that's, we call it the esoteric tradition or the Heretic tradition. It's this kind of counter culture or counter tradition that's been running alongside the mainstream one. Well, it was part of the mainstream up until about the 17th century, but since then it's been sort of...
I was going to say, what I loved about this book, because I sort of agree, but I'll turn it into a question. When did we lose this sort of knowledge and technology even of the imagination?
Well, I mean, more or less, it was something that lost its prestige with the rise of science in the early 17th century, and because one of the themes in the book and why it's called the lost knowledge of the imagination is that I'm looking at the imagination as a way of knowing. We tend to think of it as an escape from reality, or creating some kind of substitute for it, or in some utilitarian functional way as sort of being on the cutting edge and being, coming up with the next big thing and so on. But for Kathleen Rain and other people in the book that I write about and whose work I look at, they see imagination as actually a cognitive faculty. It's a way of knowing, and even deeper and deeper as we get into it, it's a way in which actually what we experience as the world comes into being, and it's in that sense that it ties into the other book, but we can get around to that. Up until about the rise of the 17th century, the rise of not just there was the rise of reason, the Age of Reason, and then the Enlightenment, and then the Age of Reason, then sort of the rise of sort of science and Francis Bacon, sort of experimental science and all that, and then the Enlightenment. But gradually, this sort of intuitive, implicit, more immediate and more value-laden and qualitative form of knowing lost its prestige in the face of the very precise, measurable, quantifiable, and also predictable and very utilitarian form of knowing that we know today as science and so on and so on. And it was sidelined. It was always considered something that was important to have some of, but it wasn't of the same rank. And but it, as I say, there was always a sort of undercurrent that understood this. I mean, the first response to this kind of sidelining of it and the rise of the Enlightenment was precisely the Romanticism that Kathleen Rain looked to, and within which she found this tradition. But again, it's the sort of thing that it's not, even though the sort of hardcore enthusiasts of the quantitative, measurable form of knowing assure us every so often that all the other stuff is just sort of nonsense or superstition, or we've gone beyond that, we progress beyond that. It doesn't go away precisely because it's part of ourselves. But from Kathleen Rain's perspective and that of other people in the book that I talk about, the fact that we have lost touch with it, the fact that it is lost, is something that it's not only a kind of faculty or something that we could benefit by that's missing. It's some part of ourselves.
And to some extent, you're correct, particularly with Descartes and so on, it's the fairly profound head traumas you get with Descartes and Kant, and then eventually 19th century materialism. But to some extent, the clock was set ticking on this with, in the case of Europe, the Socratic Turn, wasn't it? So we can actually begin this journey all the way back?
Well, yeah, sure, certainly. I mean, and that's one of the sort of the places where I say you can see the shift take place that sort of came to full bloom, let's say, with the Enlightenment. Yes, it takes place during what the philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age. And this is this period around 500 BC, give or take a century or so, in which fundamentally all of the major central sort of sacred texts and ethical and moral teachings that still pretty much hold today, even though they are kind of being dismantled, emerged. You had Confucius and also Lao Tse in China, you had the Buddha. In India, you had the Jewish patriarchs in the Holy Lands, and Zoroaster in Persia. But around the same time, what you also had in Greece and in Asia Minor, the area, what's Turkey today, similarly, with this kind of profound shift, but it wasn't so much in an ethical, moral kind of sense. It was, we can say, from a mythical to a mental, or mythical to a logical, rational, scientific even. So you have the rise of the early pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales and Anaximander and Anaxagoras, and the other ones who first sort of ask, what is the basic stuff that everything's made of? What's the fundamental matter? They're not interested in a mythic narrative of how things came into being. They're interested, if we can speak the anachronism, in what makes things tick. And they're the one who sort of get the scientific, in the sense of a disinterested, objective, curiosity about the nature of things going. And this is the sort of shift from the earlier mythical and by definition more imaginative, more poetic, sort of narrative way of understanding the world into something where we're actually sort of starting to try to understand it rationally. And it's a gradual shift. In Plato, you have somebody who's got sort of one foot in each side, because when Plato, through Socrates, wants to show that someone doesn't know what they're talking about, he'll use the dialectic, and this is when Socrates is the real, pain in the neck, and he won't let you go, and he keeps asking you questions. But when Plato wants to sort of make a positive statement about something, he'll tell you a story. He'll tell you a very good story. There's the myth of the cave and various others. But then gradually it shifted. I guess with Aristotle, it's less mythic and so on, until more or less that kind of drops away, until we get to, sort of the age of reason and so on. But there's a fantastic book called From Religion to Philosophy by Francis Cornford, written in 1912, and he was a classicist. But he talks about the two needs of human nature, and he argues that this shift from the mythical to the logical wasn't quite as clear cut and sort of definite as most of the earlier Coda historians believed, and that there still remained this sort of other way of understanding things. And it wasn't just a superstition that was hanging on. It wasn't just a atavism that we hadn't yet grown. It was part of what he called the two permanent needs of human nature.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way of doing it. There's a sort of historiographic challenge, I guess, with looking at the Socratics, and it comes from the fact that they were elevated at the same time as this kind of, more Enlightenment. Historically, they were elevated at the same time the sort of more Enlightenment way of seeing the world was. So these Enlightenment kind of people look back and say, oh, look at them, they're doing science. And it's a very difficult case to make, it seems to me. The Socratic Turn, they just sort of had a shift in almost pragmatic focus into how we live in the world. But if you look at some of Socrates' answers, and it's a false split. So it's not religion or science, because they're still full-blown metaphysicians. I mean, Socrates' doctrine of recollection, like when he gets called on the fact that he has two answers for can you teach a man virtue, he's like, oh, no, you can't, except yes, you can, because a man can learn it over many lifetimes and time spent in the afterlife and coming back and so on. And you go, well, that's not science. That's
oh yeah, sure, no, of course, yes,
and I feel kind of it's important, I think, for people who are interested in this world to be able to see through the historiographic journey of how we've viewed the Greek thinkers, because they were deeply cynical of what we would call a kind of really crass religious explanation, like Zeus throws thunderbolts, but they're still operating with it. They still have a metaphysical epistemology that we can recover and see, and is sort of broadly what we're talking about here.
Well, I think the thing is, they were able to see myths symbolically rather than just literally, which I guess is the sort of the central kind of split. Is if you're capable of understanding these things and, not in a explicit literal sense, like Zeus is throwing the thunderbolt, but okay, well, what does that mean in a larger metaphoric, metaphysical kind of thing? Which is, I guess, what the later Neoplatonists started to do, sort of reading the ancient myths in these sorts of ways. Yes, well, there seems to be a way in which the early philosophy held on to that for a time, but then gradually it sort of lost its grip. And this was, I think I'm marking this at the beginning of the 17th century because you both had sort of the rise of the practical, functionally successful, application of this new, way of looking at things, this quantifiable way. And then you also had the undermining of, one of the texts that the whole idea of imagination in some way, or the Hermetic, whatever you want to call it, the mythic, tradition, in some way, having a cognitive grasp on things that was undermined when the Corpus Hermeticum was, shown not to have been written back in the ages in the dim past, but it was a product of more recent times and so on and so on. So, and it's precisely sort of the Greek, someone paying very good attention to the Greek that understood this, that kind of textual sort of analysis.
Yeah, I think when you get to Descartes and the rise of the Enlightenment, even if the clock started ticking with the Socratic Turn, for instance, what happens for me, my read on it is it kind of makes our collapsed state inevitable once you get to the Enlightenment. It's almost like the technocratic materialism and the 19th century Darwinism as religion, and even postmodern relativism becomes inevitable once you start seeing that world. And it's just seeing the world the way the Enlightenment did, and it just took us a couple of centuries to have that particular car crash.
Well, I guess that's the thing, that sort of, well, in a way, that's why the other book, Dark Star Rising, sort of came out of Lost Knowledge, because sort of jump ahead a bit, it was while I was writing the end, the last chapters of Lost Knowledge, when I moved through, I was looking at people like Owen Barfield and Goethe and his whole experiments with trying to perceive the Urppflanze, the primal plant, and then Henri Corbin and his work with Suhrawardi and the sort of the Gnostic voyages of Suhrawardi's mysticism. And I talk about Kathleen Rain. Again, you get into this idea of the responsibility of imagination, because along the way, along with understanding imagination as a cognitive experience, we also, when we get deeper into the phenomenology of it, start to approach what people like Blake and Coleridge and the Corpus Hermeticum and others say, that in some fundamental sense, it's at the basis of our experience of the world, at all. It's what presents a world to us, and in the sort of what do you want to say? The kind of very homely sort of formulation of that is sort of we have a hand, or our minds, our inner worlds have a hand in creating the world that we perceive and understand to be outside of ourselves in the Cartesian sort of split. This was one of the things about the lost knowledge of the imagination, is that one of the things that the kind of knowledge that it makes available to us is the knowledge of the inside of things, sort of our normal, what we take to be the normal, Cartesian, measurable, quantifiable knowledge is on the surface, and so on. But this more intuitive knowledge gives us access to the interior, and that way we participate with it in some way. The sort of split that we normally or usually experience between inner and outer sort of dissipates for a while, and there's a kind of continuity between the two. And this leads on again to this kind of, if you take that down to the popular level, it becomes how you create reality. And that was what seemed to be happening in the context of, Trump's election and other things going on at the time, that people involved in the politics that were going on were sort of it seemed to be, at least, this is what, word got out about, that they were practicing forms of this kind of, creative visualization, or taking the idea that the mind is involved with the reality that we experience outside of ourselves seriously, and applying it. And it was sort of, as I was writing, I had this feeling like, oh wow, this is like history happening now around me. The very thing I'm writing about is, in this theoretical historical sense, seems to have it's in the news now. It's taking place, and it's sort of blind. I felt blindsided by it. I thought, I got that feeling by other people too. It was sort of like, oh my God, what is this? Because then suddenly, all this sort of esoteric stuff seemed to be in the news. We can get on to exactly what that is in a second, but I'm talking about how I was writing the book, and it felt like, oh wow, what I'm writing about now seems to be something that's actually happening out there. So it was kind of like history's caught up with me.
Yeah, well, that's a really good, setup for talking about Dark Star Rising, which I'm not going to lie, I had some trepidation approaching. And I guess the reason for that is there's a lot of naive neoliberal apologism, I guess, flouncing about under the banner of analysis of what's going on in the world. And I was kind of worried that we'd find some of that in it. But it's as you kind of said, it's more of a flow model, or at least it seems to me. Like there's a flow model of viewing what's happening now not as a rupture from a well-functioning neoliberal system, but its inevitability, if that makes sense. So, I mean, what's the broad thesis of the book?
Well, I mean, the reason I was talking about it in the context of lost knowledge and this idea that, again, I have to say in some way that we don't understand, our minds are involved in what we perceive to be this outer reality. The idea is that people in the alt-right who were supporting Trump were using or have used some forms of what we would call, new thought or positive thinking or mental science. Philosophies based on this idea that the mind can affect reality, basically magic, and through the internet, and that they use the internet in a way to help Trump into office. And the reason this sort of came out was that this fellow named Harvey Bishop, who's a New Thought blogger, he noted in his blog that very soon after Trump's election, Richard Spencer, who was the founder of the alt-right, and he was also the head of the National Policy Institute, which is a very sort of innocuous sounding name for a group that many people believe is not quite that innocuous. And they were very fervent Trump supporters, and they had their annual meeting in Washington, in the Ronald Reagan building. And at the head of the meeting, on the beginning of the meeting, Spencer greeted the crowd and was hailing, hail Trump, hail our leader, hail our victory. And then he was saying, we willed him into office. We dreamed him, his victory. We made this happen. And for Bishop, this meant, it looked like they were using these sorts of, sort of mental science, new thought, creative visualization techniques for, political purposes. And this sort of was like, oh, wow, what's happening? And then when I was reading about that, I was writing, the end of Lost Knowledge. And that's what I said, is suddenly it seemed like, this kind of stuff that I'm usually writing about in a historical sense and, understanding theoretically, because my main drive behind all this stuff is to understand, because I'm basically, fundamentally interested in consciousness, and to see it. Oh my God, here it is happening out in the world. And I had already written, 10 years earlier, a book, Politics and the Occult, about just that, about the relationship between politics and the occult, and mostly the sort of theme of that book was to show that although there's lots of talk about the link between occultism and far right politics and so on, and certainly there is that's obvious to anyone who pays any attention to it. It's not absolutely that, and it's not necessarily that, and that if you look at it, there's actually evidence for what you can call a progressive kind of occult politics, and people like the Rosicrucians around the very time we're talking about the early 17th century, who were trying to combine both the Hermetic sciences and the new rise of natural sciences. Also, Madame Blavatsky in the Theosophical Society, she herself was more free-thinking humanist than anything else, and was very much anti hierarchy, and the central aim really of the Theosophical Society was to form this kind of brotherhood of man, and regardless of race, creed, color, and so on and so on and so on. So you do have evidence for this kind of thing, but along with this stuff about the alt-right using what's known as meme magic, sort of posting these memes on the internet and sort of through that using them as sort of magical symbols and energies in order to affect reality, that the internet is this kind of exteriorized imagination, you can say. But there was also the stuff about like Steve Bannon name-checking Julius Evola in a speech that he gave to the Human Dignity Institute, which is sort of group of conservative churchmen in the Vatican. And in the context of his speech about the usual sorts of things, he was talking about traditional values, and he was talking about Putin, sort of giving a kind of balanced assessment of Putin. But he did refer to someone in Putin's circle who reads Julius Evola, and if you know who Julius Evola is, I mean, the fact that he was name checked in the New York Times at all struck me as like, wow, this is strange. This is it just struck me as suddenly all the stuff that's usually on the fringe of things was in smack in the center.
Well, I want to interrupt there because there's a bit that I think is important for the thesis in the book, and I guess it's so. If we talk about the things Richard Spencer said are fascinating, and even if they didn't move the needle at all with their pictures of frogs and intentionality and so on, which, to be honest, it probably didn't. The point that I think you make in the book is that they believe it did. And it's sort of the same thing when you get to having Julius Evola just be name-checked in the New York Times. I don't know if you listen to a podcast called Speaking of Jung. If you don't, it's quite good. And over the last year, they've had on people who've done kind of like a Jungian analysis of what's going on in the world. And it seems like this book is sort of doing a similar thing. These ideas are much closer to the surface now. These notions and concepts, there's a return to it. And that's, for me, I think the macro thesis of the book is how we frame. And it's certainly not just Trump, it's sort of global politics in general.
Oh, yeah.
In how we frame what's going on with an imaginal analysis. So I just wanted to drop that in right there because it should, and from a Jungian perspective alone, we should expect that, oh my goodness, Julius Evola is name-checked in the New York Times by this weird blogger that the future president currently listens to, talking about this sort of odd Rasputin figure.
Oh yeah, so that's the thing. He's name checking Evola when he's referring to he doesn't mention him by name, but it's Alexander Dugin, who is a very eccentric, remarkable character indeed, who started out as a sort of 1980s Soviet dissident sort of punk, and gradually through remarkable metamorphoses of sort of different political, mostly on the far right radical fringe, but involving sort of National Socialism and Bolshevism and a variety of different sorts of kinds of things, became a geopolitician. He's sort of made his name as a philosophy of geopolitics with a book called The Foundations of Geopolitics in 1997, which established him as a serious thinker, at least in some circles in Russia, and whose ideas about sort of Russia's destiny as the bearer of a new Eurasian civilization, I think, and others agree, have reached different degrees, have reached Putin in some way. He's not sort of Putin's Rasputin in the sense that he's talking to Putin's wife or the Tsarina, but still he's in the context in which the extent to which he is close or not, or has had influence or not, that itself remains ambiguous, and he himself has kept that ambiguous, which is part of the sort of his kind of mystique, but again, he's a reader of Evola, he's a reader of this traditionalist, but he's also into chaos magic, and he uses the chaos star, and his philosophy is about, this kind of bringing on this kind of chaos in order to bring down the old system, which again is a lot like Bannon was talking about in many of his talks and speeches and in his films, and also, the whole Kek phenomena with Pepi the Frog, and Pepi being an avatar of Kek, who's an ancient Egyptian god of chaos, and all this weird kind of stuff. And I mean, one of the themes in the book is that we seem to be in a time when, the partitions between reality and unreality, truth and falsehood, fact and fantasy have become exceedingly thin, if non-existent, and things have been sort of pulled inside out. And, I sort of, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, suggest that Trump is a kind of tulpa, this Tibetan kind of mind form that's been pulled out of the television, the reality TV, because, we've been putting reality into the television for the longest time, and it stands to reason that that whatever space is behind there will get full up, and some stuff pops out of it. And so, and again, the idea that Trump had a history as a reality television, sort of celebrity. Similarly, not in the same way, but over in Russia, Putin has sort of been behind a kind of whole reality television nation for some time, certainly during the years when Vladislav Surkov was sort of manning the controls, the political technologist. So in a sense, the sort of meme magic side of it, and Trump's whole sort of being a devotee of positive thinking, and Norman Vincent Peale, which is a branch, a tributary of New Thought and stuff. I mean, that's I see that as part of a wider kind of what do you want to call it, sort of experience that's happening where those partitions, those stable differentiations between reality and non-reality have become dismantled. And I call this trickle-down metaphysics, because it's come down from the heights of first Nietzsche, then Heidegger, and then through the kind of pop postmodernism that seems to be in play today. And it just strikes me as the kind of thing that I've been writing about, or one strain of what I've been writing about in this sort of work I've been doing over the last 20 years is sort of a history of Western consciousness, looking at it through, the lens of the Hermetic tradition, but also recently about, looking at it through the work of Ian McGilchrist in his book Master and the Emissary, with the differences between the left and right hemispheres, which also, plays a part in Lost Knowledge, and the kind of disengagement between the two has in a way kind of I don't know, or is the postmodern world and the whole kind of post-truth alternative fact world, is that a product of final kind of product of the left brain is kind of auto-da-fe, or is it kind of an eruption from the right into some sort of irrational world now?
See, I think it is, and I'm not sure if you agree, but my sense is what's going on is the absolute end, and as a result, we're seeing this kind of bizarre and unexpected phenomena, but the absolute end of that kind of relativized materialist mode. And you kind of nomically mentioned on one of the previous interviews I listened to that Trump is in some sense a singularity of this, because you can't everything, and it's, again, I just want to say, because it's not, I don't want this to sound partisan, although he's an awful man.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. That's one of the things I want to make clear. It's not necessary. It's not like an anti-Trump book.
No,
it's
that's not a pro. And I was a bit worried. Yeah,
it's not a pro-liberal book, but it is. I'm trying my best. Say, well, this is what's happening. This looks like what's going. Yeah. Isn't it fascinating that this is part of the stuff that's going on now, that these elements are in play? And it's also, well, I do think, we need to be aware that people are playing around with fascism and things of that sort.
Sure.
I think, I have lots of problems with political correctness and, liberalism and all of that, but I don't see a sort of, authoritarian right wing kind of answer to it. So it's kind of playing, in a certain sense, I'm trying to maintain a position just so I can see both sides clearly, and it's not both sides in the sense that
they're equal or equally valid.
They're equal, just that I just want to know I want to know what they're doing. Basically, I think that's the most important thing. I think.
Yeah, and that's what's so good about the book is that kind of historical contextualization sort of flow model in this imaginal way of seeing things, because inarguably it is. It seems to me the end product of a bunch of things that we used to consider true or real. Capitalism, materialism, relativism, all this sort of stuff ends in this, and also some sort of diktat saying bullshit statements. They're coming out of 8 years of being told that the economy is getting better when people are sort of dying of opioid overdoses, having not had a job in 8 years. This is the wreck that we're in, and it's fascinating to view it. And that's kind of what some of the Jungian analysis is saying. If you pretend it isn't there, guess what the shadow does to your world,
Well, exactly. No, absolutely. I think in a way it sounds portentous, but it's not going to go away anytime soon. And that's why I say in the book again, half tongue in cheek, that we can see Trump or his election as a singularity, in the sense that, well, if the singularity is some event after which, or beyond which, the usual laws of reality don't apply, as in a black hole or something like that, then certainly that seems to be the case. How we understand reality has changed since that time. Again, the post-truth, alternative fact kind of world, and it seemed that in a way seemed to happen overnight to me, because suddenly you had somebody, not just on television, bullshitting, which is what. Who's it? Henry Frankfurt, this moral philosopher, wrote a book about Trump and bullshitting, and how he's not lying, because someone who's lying actually is concerned whether you find out the truth or not, but someone who's bullshitting doesn't care one way or the other. The whole point is to impress at the moment and the effect that you have on things. And so he was doing that before, but now he's doing it in the context of world events and all that sort of thing, and also all the other baggage that he brought with him. So it seemed to happen to me very quickly. And then I said it was the context of that, and then seeing Evola in the New York Times, and then reading up various things about what was happening in Russia, and so on and so on. So this whole notion that reality suddenly became up for grabs, and again, I really did feel like something I had been reading about and charting in a sort of in my books and various different things in a kind of historical narrative actually started to. I mean, the idea. I don't want to actually say this in any way seriously, but there's the famous story of sort of Hegel, where he's sort of he's lecturing in Jena or something, and Napoleon rides in, and history on a horse showed up. But I sort of had that kind of feeling, because I did sort of feel like, oh yes, this is something that has been on the cards building up. And someone I referred to in this book and in others, the German Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser, who talked about what he called the breakdown of the mental rational structure. And again, it's the sort of, as you were saying, all these things that we believe to be stable and set and true, more or less, are being dismantled. And he wrote his magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin, in the 40s, but he lived until the early 70s. And I don't know how aware he was of the rise of postmodernism and deconstructionism, but he was certainly aware of Heidegger, and who sort of gets that ball rolling. So, I'm sure he would have seen these developments, what we're going through now, as a sign that yes, this is what's happening. But it's no picnic, and the reason it's kind of like. What I want to say, slightly ironic calling Trump the singularity, because in the common sort of New Age popular idea of this is supposed to be some transformative event where basically the millennium is going to come on and all that, and it's happened, but it's not happened in the way that everyone wanted it to happen.
Gary, Gotham always gets the singularity it deserves. That's what I think. This is. I just want to ask a Dugan question, because I can't remember. I think I watched an interview with him and Jay Dyer last year or whatever. But was it in that 1997 book where he has this idea, which is wrong about Russia, but maybe not about the West, that Russia is a land power. It's Eurasian, so it's stable.
Yes.
But the West is a sea power, so it's treacherous and lying and smash and grab and thieving, and it's kind of fluid with its truth. Was that in the 90s? Like, 'cause weirdly, that's wrong about Russia.
Yes. It's an idea that's actually based on a British historian named Halford Mackinder.
Oh, right.
Who in the pre-World War I, he was trying to convince whoever the War Office that Russia was the real sort of one to look out for England, not Germany. And he had this notion that there were two main sort of oppositions in the world, and their struggle was sort of the motor of history. And he said there was the seafaring Atlanticists, nations, and that's at the time, obviously, that's the British Empire, but the United States and what we would call NATO today, North Atlantic, and I guess Japan as well over in the Pacific. And then you have, Pacific, Atlantic Pacificists, and but as you say, you have Eurasia, which is the central largest landmass on the planet, and this was the mother of all continents. And this term Eurasia has been around in different contexts at different times, and I've noticed that recently it's come up in a kind of economic context, and I know that Putin has been involved in sort of trying to put together Eurasian kind of economic union in the way like the EU thing, but its roots go back to sort of the emigre Russian philosophers leaving Russia after the Bolsheviks, and they settled in Paris or Prague, places like that, and they believed that the Bolsheviks weren't going to last, that the revolution wouldn't hold up, and but they also didn't want to return to a monarchy and the Tsarist regime. So what they wanted to do is they were trying to come up with a new idea of what Russia was about. And again, this is a central sort of theme in Russian history, like Russia, what is Russia about? What does it mean to be Russia? What's Russia's identity? That's something that's still going through today. And they had this idea that rather than being a backward cousin of Europe, rather than trying to catch up to Europe all the time, which it never quite does, the westernized sort of stuff it absorbs and tries to incorporate never quite takes. It should look to its Asian, basically the roots in the Mongols and the people of the steppes, the Tatars and all this sort of thing, who conquered sort of early Russia and then ruled for some centuries and all that. And the whole idea was this Spenglerian notion, like Oswald Spengler, who's wrote the classic book, The Decline of the West, who argued that rather than a linear history, a kind of linear progress, from whatever day one to now, with civilizations, sort of moving in this kind of sequence, you have these sort of organic living civilizations that are born, grow, mature, and then they die, and they sort of are self-enclosed. So it's not it's a kind of cultural relativism rather than a kind of sort of linear idea of progress. And taking that idea, they were seeing Eurasia as this new civilization that was coming into its own as the West was sort of going out. And that idea didn't take then in the 1920s, but it's something that Dugin has picked up on again and has incorporated again into this weird melange that he froths up of National Socialism and Bolshevism and fascisms and Heidegger, and he kind of, as I said, he has this kind of Lego approach again, which is very postmodern. And something we only sort of mentioned kind of on the periphery is chaos magic, which I talk about in the book too. He's sort of, I don't know how much of a practitioner, but he certainly uses the symbols of chaos magic. But the style in which he puts things together is very much like that too. And the chaos magic is postmodern, I would say, in the sense that it takes bits and pieces of other things and sort of puts it together, like objet trouve. It's sort of found art. It takes stuff, puts it together, and then suddenly it's an art piece or something like that. Well, Dugin does this with sort of ideologies. He does this with ideas about global history and so on. So this one about this ongoing final struggle between the forces of the seafaring nations and the land-based ones. This is something that has informed, I believe, to a not small degree, Putin's sort of strategy. And I think you can trace its influence in what happened in Crimea and what happened in Ukraine.
And, well, the economic stuff, I would, even before all that, energy agreements with China and that kind of thing. There's clearly, what fascinates me about this Mackinder/Dugan concept is it's probably wrong about Russia, but I'm not sure it's wrong about the West, like 19th century Britain, 20th century America. And this is what's fascinating about the melange, right? Like, as you say, the idea of Russia is a stable and continuous idea, like that's synthetic, right?
That's the thing. True. That's not true of Russia's past history. Russia's history is history. It's sort of like Russia is like England, like London doesn't have a climate; it has weather. So Russia it doesn't have history. It has all the stuff that makes up history. So there's nothing but turbulence, and but this is the idea that out of all of that, now it's in its birth throes of what it was aiming towards in the past things like the Russian Empire, Muscovy, the Soviets. All that was sort of like I don't want to call it kind of preliminaries to what's happening now, and how Dugan sees it, and how I believe Putin has been sort of playing it is the idea that the Atlantists, how they are sort of how they are going to sort of take over the world is not necessarily through seafaring naval power, but it's the spread. Globalization is the spread of neoliberalism. It's the spread of this kind of anything goes kind of consumer world, which Dugan wants to sort of hold Russia and Eurasia up as a kind of embodiment of traditional values that's going to oppose that. And he talks about the multipolar world. And this is something that Putin himself has used in several of his speeches, where it's kind of holy Russia. I mean, the return to holy Russia as the sort of the true standard bearer of the real faith of traditional Christian values against the West, which is sinking in this mire of sort of indulgence and tolerance of everything.
Well, see, that's, I think, his principal magic. You see his use of iconography and kind of those beautiful, ornate, orthodox big doors that open up when he sort of shows up to give his speeches or what have you. Yeah. He's assuming the traditional trappings of Moscow as defender of particularly that kind of orthodox Christian civilization, and that I think because as you kind of point out, and Dugan's a fascinating character, which is why he's in the book. But as you kind of point out, it's really the connections to Putin aren't at all as strong as some of the alarmist stuff that happened. That was written in the West about those two. There's some shared ideology, but it seems to me Putin's genuine use of magic.
I think Putin's a strategist.
Yeah, sure.
He's. It's not like even though Dugan would like that to be the case, or at least he says that he would like that to be the case, because he makes these rather gnomic statements about the more Putin is like Dugan, the more he is like himself, and it's like Svengali. When you sing, you will sing only for me. But he's a showman too. If you've seen any of the sort of interviews he does live, he often walks away in a huff and all this kind of thing. So I mean, they're not adverse to sort of using image and all that, and that's exactly what Putin does when he shows up at the churches and at the sort of sacred sites and all that sort of thing. But it's something that works for him because and I guess how much Dugan is going to get exactly how he sees things out of it is another question. But just the idea that these people are not they're not just on the fringe, or
exactly.
They're actually. I mean, the things like Evola. Dugan walks more the corridors of power than Evola, ever did, and Evola wanted to, but he actually got in there. I mean, how much longer and exactly how much it is now, I don't know. I mean, I've done the research. It's like almost a year ago now. So, but actually, I'm working on a follow up to it now. So, about this whole idea of Holy Russia and sort of the revival of that.
Yeah, cool. Well, as you say, it doesn't. What's so, I think, interesting about the book is it doesn't necessarily matter for the thesis how close he is. The fact that he is close to the surface of consciousness.
He's there at all.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of says something about it. But that brings us, I guess we sort of loop back to Lost Knowledge. Mm-hmm. What do we do about this?
So, there you go.
What do we do about the car crash we're in?
Well, I guess, some people are taking the sort of magic side of it very seriously. I mean, there's, the witches against Trump, this global spell casting that happens every month to sort of bind him and all those who abet him. But in terms of, I guess it all depends on how seriously you take the idea that, what we think in some way, can affect the world outside in some direct sort of way. I mean, as I've been sort of saying it in some interviews, unlike Vegas, what happens in the mind maybe doesn't always necessarily stay there. So, and again, I'm not trying to say, oh, it's true and it works and we really need to worry and, everybody get together and think positive thoughts. But I mean, what leads me to have an open mind about it is that what I say in the book is I think I think one of the cruxes is if you accept the phenomenon of synchronicity. And because that's fundamentally what the whole meme magic and using the internet, is based on, and it got dubbed synchro mysticism when people noticed that, all this stuff we're posting on the web seems to be having effect out in the real world in some way. And so I say in the book, synchronicity is when something happening in the mind and something happening outside in the real world has this immediate, direct, indubitable, meaningful connection, and it has to have that kind of impact on you. It's not just what a coincidence. It's something that has a real kind of powerful impact on you. And if you accept that happens, and to be honest, I have to say, well, I do, because I've had enough of them, and a few other things related to that to convince me that these things happen. I don't know how they happen. And I've not been convinced by any sort of explanation, whether it's quantum physics or anything else, to explain them. But still, I believe how it happens, I don't know. But on occasion, somehow, there is this kind of participatory relationship between what's happening in my mind and what's happening out in the real world. And it has a meaningful content to it. So if you accept that, then I guess I would have to say I can't categorically deny that in some way something happening on the internet can have some effect out in the real world. Is whether you can induce it or not. Can you induce synchronicities? And I would say that's the crux of magic. Magic is, in some way, if it ever works, it's somehow by inducing the synchronicities. And this is what people involved in chaos magic, as far as I can tell, believe can happen. And the way that it's talked about. The notion of achievable results and, being able to affect reality in a way that is not, fantastic. Ironically, it's like don't expect miracles, but, it's something that could happen. But somehow you have to nudge it in some kind of, sort of magical sort of way. And that's not very different than the sort of positive thinking and new thought sort of stuff that, Trump is steeped in. So although there's no direct relationship, say, between Trump and chaos magic, I would say the phenomenology of the magic involved and the techniques and the intent too, because both positive thinking and new thought and chaos magic are results driven. They're results based. The whole idea is to make something happen. And so it's very practical in that way. And so I'm saying it's a big if, but if you take that seriously, then I think you have to sort of consider, yes, exactly. What do we do about the idea that the mind can affect, the outer world? And that's where I bring in this idea of the responsibility of the imagination, with which I ended Lost Knowledge. And that comes from the British philosopher of language, Owen Barfield, who was also one of the Inklings, and he was a great friend of C.S. Lewis. But he believed, and he wrote quite a few books arguing very eloquently and cogently that, again, there is this participatory relationship between the mind and reality, what we call reality, and the kind of very rigid Cartesian split that we experience as normal, meaning that there's an external world out there that's hard and solid and has existed, long before I arrived on the scene, and there's like a little puddle of consciousness inside my skull. That's something that's arrived at historically. That's something that's been developed, and we were talking about when, that idea sort of started to take hold, we're saying the early 17th century. Prior to that, and this is linking up with the much earlier mythic way of knowing things that began to lose prestige or lose dominance with back in the axial age with the rise of the rational in Greece. There was this participatory relationship, and Barfield became convinced of this because he could trace it in language. He saw that if you trace language all the way back, as far back as we can go, it has this undeniable kind of metaphoric, poetic, what we would call imaginative character. And that only over time does it develop a kind of literal, prosaic character that, ironically, language theorists at the time of the early 20th century, people like Max Muller, they were saying, no, everything had to start out in this very prosaic kind of literal way, and the caveman pointed to something and grunted ugh, and ugh just meant, whatever that stone he was pointing to. And at some point, we don't know exactly why this happened. This is generation of poets who suddenly, embellished everything with this wonderful, lively kind of language, but then they sort of disappeared. But Barfield was saying, well, actually, that's the only way they could picture those things, because they were under the spell of the Darwinian, kind of cumulative, progressive way of envisioning the development of something. And he said, but the evidence that language itself gives us, it tells us something different. It tells us no, instead, that what seems to be the case was at the earliest time, the language started out as this very poetic, lively, imaginative, figurative kind of character. And then, as I said, gradually becomes prosaic. And Barfield came to the conclusion, well, that suggests to me that at that time, that's how people saw the world. They experienced the world in that way. And only gradually did the kind of separation that we experience as normal and natural take place. But he found that when he read poetry, and again, we're going back in the same territory that Kathleen Rain explored, when he read his favorite romantic poets, if he was in the right mood, he would have a sudden sort of flash of that kind of participatory consciousness. And again, it was a sort of lively, metaphoric, figurative, vital perception of the world was generated by the poetry. And he came to the conclusion that if in the beginning we had what he called original participation, when we were embedded in the world and part of it, but didn't have the separation, we're heading towards what he calls final, where we can experience that participation but not give up our rational independent consciousness. So, and this is something that we can experience now. So, but he's someone else that I talk about in the book. But he believed that as he coined the phrase interior is interior. Interior is anterior, meaning what happens in the inside is prior to what we see out in the world. And so he did believe that we had, it was incumbent upon us to be sort of very aware of what we were actually using our imagination for, because it will eventually find its way out into the world. And this was, echoed years later by Henri Corbin, who also talked about without the guidance of a kind of tradition of the imagination, it would become subject to what he called our kind of will to power, in the sense that we would use the imagination for less than noble and enlightened purposes.
Yeah. I was only aware of Owen Barfield in my kind of Tolkien nerd sense, as you said, as someone who, one of the people I never bothered to look into, who was occasionally there at the Bird and Bub drinking. So I found the Owen Barfield stuff in the book genuinely fascinating. There are some, I think, really profound esoteric implications if we pull on the Barfieldian thread that language began mythically or figuratively and kind of declined into, if you will, literalism. If we started with that, something that, approximates romantic poetry, or that is filled with, figurative language, if we started with that, there's something like really significant in terms of the story of mankind there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Again, this ties in, as I said, with the notion of the two permanent needs of human nature. We talk about the fall, and the fall is our sort of exodus from that participatory state. But Barfield and Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, who he draws on and was very influenced by, and is a very eloquent expositor of, and others, and Gebser and others I'm talking about, they all agree that sort of transition from the earlier, more embedded, originally participatory state was necessary. We needed to leave that because we have to develop our individual consciousness. We have to develop reason and rationality and all that kind of thing. And getting back to what you were saying earlier about how we seem to be at the end of that trail in many ways, and that's what's happened. We have developed that. And Gebser would say we're in the throes, the beginning sort of stages or throes of this, what he called the integral stage, integral structure of consciousness appearing as the mental rational breaks down. And you transfer the Barfieldian sort of terms and say, this where the separation from the world that we've experienced as normal, but which actually has an historical result, is changing, and that's in different ways. As you say, sort of the conclusions drawn from that, they're kind of coming to an end. They're sort of becoming. This is one of the things that struck me some years ago, and I read this fantastic book called "From Dawn to Decadence" by the American historian Jacques Barzun, who died just a few years ago at the age of 107. I believe, but he wrote this book. It's like, I think 2000 it came out. So he was of quite advanced years, but he was still very, very sharp and brilliant compos mentis. But he's someone who saw most of the 20th century. But what he saw was basically all of the variety of different goods, the values that merged sort of from the Enlightenment and on, the Renaissance on, and the Enlightenment. It's sort of as if for a long time they were kind of kept separate from each other, and so they could all be pursued without interfering. But now they seem to have kind of jammed up. There's a kind of traffic jam, and so I guess the classic example is where to ensure each individual's freedom, you have to make more and more laws. The kind of so there's more and more ways to protect each other, and we're more protected, but we're actually more kind of restricted by a variety of different kind of constraints and so on. And so it's very much along these lines. I think sort of the what was good and what was valuable and needed and indispensable has sort of been mined out of that, and it's kind of exhausting itself. And this is, yes. So again, I tie it in with Ian McGilchrist, who's talking about how the left brain has sort of arrived at this kind of dominance over the right, when throughout history there's been kind of a system of checks and balances between the two, and they occasionally work very well together, and you have ages of periods of great genius, but usually they're in a kind of conflict, but in the end things kind of add up, equal out. But for the last couple of centuries the left has maintained a kind of dominance over the right, and again the left is this analytic, atomizing way of breaking things up into bits and pieces in order to manipulate it and control it, and the right gives a very broad, global, implicit, deep meaning kind of perception of things, but it can't sort of express it in explicit formulae in the way that the left can. And so I think all these different ways, these different thinkers, they're saying, I don't want to say they're saying the same thing, because they're not exactly saying the same thing, but what they are saying are related to each other, and they cover aspects of the same process that's going on now.
Yeah, blind man and the elephant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you can and I guess what I try to do is put them all together. That's, the best I can. And, that's sort of what Dark Star done in that. And the one thing different about that book is that it's mostly a work of journalism. It's like, okay, this was, I wrote it a year ago, but at the time it was like, this is happening now, where mostly everything else I've written is either historical or it's a biography. But again, it's putting these bits and pieces together. And again, it's like you're talking about Jung, and we know that Jung says, the unconscious has to be sort of led into the conversation, and if it isn't let in politely, and us going out to it, it'll come in anyway. It can, and I think in a way that's something that's happening now too. All this
think,
eruption of the stuff that we haven't paid attention to, or the mainstream official, cognoscenti haven't paid attention to, and now it's kind of, here we are. What are you going to do about it?
No, absolutely. I think that is, for me, the most useful macro analysis, as you say, of all these different thinkers and writers. That Jungian notion that people don't have ideas have people. And if you pull on if you stand back and look at the timeline from, say, Axial Age to now, and kind of zero in or pinch in on the last couple of centuries, and you see certain ideas like Enlightenment concepts and so on emerging from this place and running around the world, doing some things, wrecking lots, and here we are at a point in the timeline where there's some sort of pivot, or there are new ideas that need to work together, and it's probably 50 years too late, like in the sense that it looks like this because we ignored it for 50 years.
yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah. All right. Well, Gary, congratulations on both books. I consider the sort of lost knowledge of the imagination to be in your kind of quest for line, that sort of story. As you know, Quest is, I think, still my favorite. This is a close second, Gary Lachman book. I still hand it out to people. But this has been fantastic. So for people who want to know more...
my pleasure. Thank you so much, Gordon.
Yeah, for people who want to know more, where can they find you? What do you got going on? That sort of thing?
My blog, it's garylachman.co.uk. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, so you can find me there. Drop me a line.
Wonderful, and thanks once again.
My pleasure.
Always a good time talking to Gary Lachman. The exploration of Owen Barfield's work in Lost Knowledge of the Imagination lines up more or less perfectly with the thesis in my Campfire's Edge presentation regarding the probable extra-dimensional origins of human cultural complexity. The book adds some extra heroes to the line of Hermetic history covered in several of Gary's other books as well. And I respect what Dark Star seeks to convey in addition to that, although, as you might expect, there are a few places in which I depart from it. For instance, we have different definitions of what constitutes chaos magic, obviously. But that's fine. It's not that you can smash two emotive words together and copyright them, right? Chaos and magic. They do tend to hang together and are valid descriptions of some of the stuff in the book. You'll recall a similar thing happened to the words Golden Dawn, for instance, and the rise of the far right in Greece in 2011. It's a hard thing to do, writing a book about politics without it coming across as political. There are places I wanted to jump in with yes, but, particularly around the rise of Putin coming out of the trap laid by the IMF for Yeltsin and the subsequent rape of Russia by Anglo-American banking powers. There's a very good book on the topic by Anne Williamson on that disastrous process. And of course, Martin Armstrong goes into the IMF plot, which is a big part of why he was sent to prison in the film The Forecaster. And also probably Angela Nagel's work, which we've discussed before, on the alt-right being of a piece with centrist identitarianism. And I mention these not because they would detract from Dark Star Rising's point, but actually because they would have contributed to it, which is, one, we need an appreciation of longer timelines so as to kind of get a fuller view of our situation as an inevitability rather than a rupture. And so, for instance, my interest in cycle models is of a piece there. And number two, the other point is a wider interpretive frame that includes something like the collective unconscious or the imaginal or whatever you want to call it is needed to think with what's going on in the world at the moment. Once you have both these things, you see how Gary's latest two books fly together because they strongly suggest valid courses of action, which brings us back, for instance, to some of the things my discussion with David Holmgren threw up regarding rethought activism, albeit in a slightly more haunted way. Anyway, that's the show. Further details on both books and where to find Gary and so on in the show notes. Let me know what you think at runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page. And find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.